Thank you very much for this opportunity to give a brief statement. Dear shareholders, dear representatives of the cantons and cantonal banks, dear members of the Bank Council, and dear members of the Directorate, there is a war in Europe, as we have already heard, and there is also inflation in Europe, as we have heard. Among other things, due to the enormous euro reserves of the Swiss National Bank, we are affected by both strengths as necessary. I would like to illuminate these 2 points a bit. Firstly, our reserves make us politically dependent. Today, it may still be unthinkable that the European Central Bank or the U.S. Federal Reserve would freeze the assets of the Swiss National Bank. But what if we want to remain neutral in the next war? Could we withstand the pressure from abroad, given our monetary dependence? I believe Helvetia could sleep more peacefully, and Switzerland could make free decisions if the Swiss National Bank were to shift part of its reserves into a politically neutral investment that could not be frozen for political reasons at any time. Secondly, it can be assumed that real interest rates in the euro area will remain deep in negative territory for an extended period. The nominal prime rate is still at 0%, and the official inflation rate is between 7 and 8%. The German Producer Price Index already indicates inflation of more than 30%, the highest level since the beginning of the survey in 1949. Instead of being concerned with their mandate, the European Central Bank has been financing government spending through the back door for years, and this is not just my finding but that of the German Federal Constitutional Court. Against this backdrop is holding hundreds of billions in a currency where double-digit devaluation is foreseeable, really compatible with your mandate to preserve value. Dear members of the Directorate, don't we have to look for alternatives here? The answer is, of course, yes, we would have to. But unfortunately, more than 100 billion in Eurobonds cannot be easily disposed of without causing market distortions. That's why they need an investment with a high implicit leverage, or a financial mathematical beta. They also need an investment that, in the long term, for every percent that the euro goes down, goes up 10% or even more, and thus can already offset their foreseeable euro loss in an inflation scenario with a comparatively small stake. And with that, we come to Bitcoin, which is perfectly suited for this strategy to hedge against a euro loss. With much more cautious desire, I am joined by over 30 shareholders who have been mentioned at the meeting. We approached them, wanting to prepare for the first years, but unfortunately, no action was taken. If I could decide here and now, I would immediately shift 1 billion euros into Bitcoin at the end of each month. However, this is not the case, so I must limit myself to calculating how much damage they could have avoided with my strategy in 1 year. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Meisser. May I ask the President? Good, thank you. Also, the question submitted by you and your fellow shareholders has already touched on various topics. It is important for us that our investment policy can support monetary policy and that the preservation of our currency reserves is ensured over time. This is not an easy task, as we have large volatilities and large fluctuations in the valuation of various assets over time. For us, it is important that our currency reserves are relatively liquid, or that a large part of them are invested in liquid assets and that we can diversify broadly. Therefore, for us, foreign exchange investments are mainly focused on government bonds, corporate bonds, and stocks. In addition, we have investments in gold, which also belong to our currency reserves. We also saw this at the beginning of the balance sheet, with reserve positions at the IMF or international means of payment and drawing rights. For us, these are what we include under currency reserves. From our current perspective, Bitcoin is not an asset that meets the requirements of a reserve currency. Bitcoin is still not a currency in the true sense of the word, as the functions of a currency are not fulfilled. Instead, it is more of a speculative asset. Bitcoin does not offer the necessary security that we otherwise require for investments. and the necessary tradability is not given, especially for larger volumes. Compared to traditional currencies, we have much higher volatility and much lower liquidity. As I said, today there is a group of investors who buy bitcoins for speculative purposes. In your inquiry, you also asked us whether we should create the necessary conditions to buy Bitcoin. Buying Bitcoin is actually not a problem for us. We can either do it directly or buy investment products based on Bitcoin. We can do it ourselves or assign someone accordingly. So, we can create the technical and operational requirements relatively quickly if we are convinced that we need to include Bitcoin in our balance sheet. The point, however, is that we don't do this due to technical or operational reasons or other conditions, but because we believe that from today's perspective, Bitcoin does not meet the requirements of a currency reserve. That's why we have decided not to include Bitcoins in our balance sheet so far. Thank you very much.
Wir können das entweder selber machen oder auch jemand entsprechend mandatieren. Also die technischen und operativen Voraussetzungen, die können wir relativ schnell schaffen, wenn wir der Überzeugung sind, dass wir Bitcoin in unsere Bilanz aufnehmen müssen. Der Punkt ist aber, dass wir nicht wegen technischen oder operativen Bedingungen oder Rahmenbedingungen das nicht machen, sondern weil wir der Überzeugung sind, dass Bitcoin zumindest aus heutiger Perspektive eben die Anforderungen an Währungsreserven nicht erfüllt, und deshalb haben wir bis heute auch entschieden, keine Bitcoins in unsere Bilanz aufzunehmen. Besten Dank.
Esteemed attendees, thank you for the opportunity to briefly address a topic that is becoming increasingly important for more and more people. I am referring to the speech by Luzius Meisser from the Bitcoin Association Switzerland at last year's General Meeting, also here in front of you, and the question of whether the cryptocurrency Bitcoin should be included in the money supply. At that time, we were informed that the National Bank could easily create the technical and operational conditions to acquire and hold Bitcoins, but that it would refrain from doing so for monetary policy considerations. However, how would a conservative admixture of Bitcoin in the balance sheet of the Swiss National Bank have affected it? We have recalculated. If the Swiss National Bank, as suggested by us, had exchanged Eurobonds worth 1 billion Swiss francs for Bitcoin at the end of each month, the balance sheet of the SNB would have improved by over 3 billion Swiss francs since the last general meeting.
So hätte sich die Bilanz der SNB seit der letzten Generalversammlung über 3 Milliarden Schweizer Franken besser entwickelt.
Bitcoin is voluntary, neutral, decentralized, and stable money. What do you think of these properties, dear shareholders? I quote, "The classic Swiss who attaches importance to them should reconsider his skeptical attitude towards the project and examine Bitcoin with its special properties without prejudice." This is what the editor-in-chief of the Swiss Monthly Magazine recently said.
Chefredakteur des Schweizer Monats in der März-Ausgabe der Zeitschrift.
We were pleased to learn and hear directly from the SNB Directorate on Swiss television that Bitcoin is, I quote, "a very interesting concept." However, in our opinion, cryptocurrency is much more than just a very interesting concept. The value of Bitcoin is likely to prove to be a wise long-term decision in times of rapid global monetary devaluation and related political and economic uncertainties. In the sense of diversification and reducing dependencies on the gigantic foreign debt mountains, we would like to suggest again that it be examined whether Bitcoin should not be included in the balance sheet of the SNB. Thank you for your attention.
Dass geprüft wird, ob Bitcoin nicht der Bilanz der SNB beizumischen ist. Besten Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
Thank you, Mr. Andreotti. We will take this suggestion into account.